The next few days after receiving the traffic ticket were particularly difficult for James Wilson. His small apartment, usually a place of solitude, now felt like a prison as he wrestled with his mounting concerns. The citation on his kitchen table showed a fine of $275, nearly a quarter of his monthly pension. Living alone since his wife Martha's passing 2 years ago had already been challenging enough. She had always been the one who handled their paperwork and appointments, her organizational skills making up for his struggles with memory and anxiety. Now, James spent his evenings staring at the ticket, his reading glasses perched on his nose, trying to understand his options. One evening, while attempting to budget his limited funds, James's hands began to shake more than usual. His PTSD medication was running dangerously low, and without a timely refill, the nightmares would return in full force. He glanced at the small wooden box on his dresser, where he kept his military medals and a faded photograph of his old platoon. The memories of Vietnam that he fought so hard to keep at bay seemed closer to the surface these days. His neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, noticed something was wrong when she saw James sitting on his front porch, looking more distressed than usual. She had been bringing him homemade meals twice a week since Martha passed, knowing how hard it was for him to cook for himself. This evening, she found him holding an old photo album, his eyes distant. "The court date is next week," James explained when she asked what was troubling him. "I haven't been in a courtroom since serving on jury duty in '92. Martha was with me then." His voice cracked slightly at the mention of his late wife's name. Mrs. Rodriguez sat with him as he shared more about his struggles. The missing of the VA appointment had indeed resulted in his medication running low. His arthritis made it difficult to drive some days, and his failing eyesight meant he could no longer drive at night. The traffic violation was just the tip of an iceberg of challenges he faced daily. That night, as James prepared for bed, he pulled out his old military dress uniform from the back of his closet. It had been years since he'd worn it, but it was the most formal attire he owned. As he carefully brushed off the dust, his fingers traced over the combat ribbons and medals. Each one told a story, represented a sacrifice, marked a moment when he had served his country with pride. The uniform needed minor repairs, a loose button, a small tear in the sleeve. James's hands weren't steady enough for detailed sewing work anymore, but Mrs. Rodriguez offered to help. She spent an afternoon fixing the uniform while James told her stories about his service, including the day he earned his Purple Heart. What troubled James most wasn't just the fine, though that was serious enough, but the feeling of losing control over his life. The independence he had fought so hard to maintain was slipping away, piece by piece. He couldn't help but think about the young soldier he had once been, leading missions through dense jungles, making split-second decisions that meant life or death. Now, he struggled with traffic lights and appointment times. A week before his court date, James received a call from the VA hospital. They had an opening for a medication review, but it was at night, a time when he no longer felt safe driving. When he explained his situation, the administrator's voice became distant and professional, offering the next available daytime appointment in 3 weeks. That evening, as James sat in his favorite armchair, he noticed his hands were steadier as he held his military photo album. Something about touching the old uniform, preparing to face the court with the same dignity he had carried through his military service, gave him a sense of purpose. He might be struggling, but he wasn't defeated. Mrs. Rodriguez had helped him press his uniform and even offered to drive him to the courthouse. As he hung the uniform on his bedroom door, ready for the upcoming court date, James didn't know that his appearance in traffic court would lead to an unexpected encounter that would change everything. The judge he was about to meet had more in common with him than he could possibly imagine. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a heavy fog blanketing Springfield. James Wilson woke up before dawn, his military habits still ingrained after all these years. His hands trembled slightly as he brewed his morning coffee, but not from nervousness. He had been rationing his medication, taking only half doses to make it last longer. As he carefully put on his freshly pressed military dress uniform, James caught his reflection in the bedroom mirror. Despite his age, he still stood straight and tall, just as his drill sergeant had taught him decades ago. The uniform, though slightly looser now, still fit well enough. The medals and ribbons on his chest caught the early morning light, each one a testament to his service and sacrifice. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived at exactly 7:30 a.m., just as she had promised. She gasped softly when she saw James in his full military dress. "You look like a general," she said warmly, helping him with his tie, which his arthritic fingers struggled to knot properly. James managed a small smile, grateful for her kindness. The drive to the courthouse was quiet. James held his cane between his knees, his citation paper folded neatly in his pocket. The morning traffic moved slowly through the fog, and James noticed how the city had changed over the years. Buildings he once knew had been replaced by newer structures, but the courthouse remained the same, an imposing stone building that looked exactly as it had when he served on jury duty years ago. As they climbed the courthouse steps, James had to pause several times to catch his breath. A young security officer noticed his struggle and quickly brought over a wheelchair, but James politely declined. "I can walk," he said firmly, gripping his cane tighter. "I've walked through worse than this." The courtroom was already filling up when they entered. Young people in casual clothes, lawyers in suits, and police officers in uniform created a busy atmosphere that made James's anxiety spike. Mrs. Rodriguez found them seats near the front, knowing James's hearing wasn't what it used to be. Officer Martinez, who had issued the citation, was present in the courtroom. She recognized James immediately and approached him before the proceedings began. "Good morning, sir," she said respectfully, noting his impressive military dress. "I remember you from that morning. I hope everything worked out with your VA appointment." James explained quietly that he had missed the appointment and was still struggling with his medication schedule. Officer Martinez's expression softened with concern, and she made some notes in her paperwork before returning to her position. As they waited for the judge to arrive, James observed the other people in the courtroom. Most were there for minor violations like his own, parking tickets, speeding citations, routine traffic incidents. But none were dressed in military uniform, and he noticed several people looking at him with curiosity and respect. A young court clerk approached James just before the session was to begin. "Sir," she said quietly, "Judge Roberts noticed your military uniform when he arrived. He's asked if you would be willing to have your case heard first." James nodded, though his heart began to beat faster at the prospect of being first. The bailiff's voice rang out clearly. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Michael Roberts presiding." As everyone stood, James used his cane to push himself up, standing as straight as his aging body would allow. Judge Roberts entered the courtroom, his black robes flowing as he walked to the bench. He was younger than James, probably in his early 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that scanned the courtroom. When his gaze fell on James, something flickered across his face, a look of recognition, perhaps, or something deeper. As James waited to be called forward, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He had faced far worse situations than this, the memories of jungle warfare, of carrying wounded comrades to safety, of nights spent in terror and days spent in courage. All of these had prepared him for this moment. Little did James know that his appearance in this courtroom, in his carefully preserved uniform, bearing the marks of his service and sacrifice, was about to trigger an extraordinary series of events that would forever change not just his life, but the lives of many others in his community. On a crisp autumn morning in September 2023, James Wilson's day started like any other. The 72-year-old Vietnam veteran woke up at 5:30 a.m. in his modest one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Springfield. His old bones ached as he slowly made his way to the kitchen, where he took his morning medications with a glass of water that shook slightly in his trembling hands. James had an important appointment at the VA hospital that morning. His PTSD medication was running dangerously low, and the recurring nightmares have been getting worse over the past week. The appointment was scheduled for 9:00 a.m., and usually he would have left early enough to avoid any rush. However, today was different. His ancient alarm clock had failed to ring at the usual time, and he had dozed off again after taking his morning pills. When he finally looked at the time, it was already 8:30 a.m. The VA hospital was a 40-minute drive away under normal conditions, and being late wasn't an option. The VA was strict about appointment times, and missing one meant waiting another 3 weeks for a new slot. James quickly grabbed his worn leather jacket, the one he'd had since the 1980s, and hurried to his old Ford Taurus. The car, much like its owner, had seen better days, but it was reliable enough to get him where he needed to go. As he settled into the driver's seat, his hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white with anxiety. The morning traffic was heavier than usual. Road construction on Main Street forced him to take an unfamiliar detour through residential areas. His heart raced as the digital display on his dashboard showed 8:50 a.m. The hospital was still 15 minutes away, and he could feel the familiar tightness in his chest that came with anxiety. As James approached the intersection of Oak and Cedar Streets, he saw the traffic light turning yellow. In any other situation, you would have slowed down and waited. But today, the thought of missing his appointment and running out of medication pushed him to make a decision he would later regret. The light had just turned red when his Taurus entered the intersection. Officer Sarah Martinez had been parked nearby, monitoring the morning traffic. She immediately noticed the blue Taurus running the red light and pulled out to follow it. The car's brake lights came on as soon as her patrol car became visible in the rearview mirror, and it pulled over properly, indicating that the driver was at least cooperative. As she approached the vehicle, Officer Martinez noticed the veteran's license plate and the small American flag decal on the rear window. The elderly man behind the wheel was visibly distressed, his weathered hands still gripping the steering wheel. When she asked for his license and registration, she couldn't help but notice how his hands trembled as he reached for his wallet. "Sir, are you aware that you ran a red light back there?" Officer Martinez asked, keeping her tone professional but gentle. James looked up at her with tired eyes. "Yes, ma'am, I know I did wrong. I'm trying to get to the VA hospital for my appointment. I'm already late, and if I miss it..." His voice trailed off as he fought to maintain his composure. Officer Martinez observed the man's military tattoo on his forearm, partially visible beneath his jacket sleeve, and the small purple heart pin on his lapel. She could tell this wasn't a reckless driver or someone with disregard for traffic laws. This was a veteran in distress, but the law was the law. "I understand your situation, sir, but running a red light puts both you and others at risk," she explained while writing the citation. "The court date is listed here, and you can either pay the fine or appear in court to explain your situation." James accepted the ticket with a resigned nod. He watched in his side mirror as Officer Martinez returned to her patrol car, then placed the citation on his passenger seat. The paper seemed to mock him, another burden to bear, another problem to solve with his limited pension. By the time he arrived at the VA hospital, it was 9:20 a.m. As he feared, the receptionist informed him that he had missed his slot and would need to reschedule. Walking back to his car, James felt the weight of the morning's events bearing down on his shoulders. The ticket in his car represented more than just a traffic violation. It was a reminder of how complicated life had become in his golden years. Little did James know that this traffic violation would lead to an extraordinary sequence of events that would change not only his life, but also the lives of many others in his community. Case number 2347, James Wilson, the court clerk announced. "Approach the bench, please." James gripped his cane firmly and made his way forward. The sound of his measured steps and the gentle tap of his cane echoed in the now silent courtroom. As he drew closer to the judge's bench, he could feel Judge Roberts' intense gaze fixed upon him, particularly on the medals adorning his uniform. Judge Roberts leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he focused on one particular medal. "Mr. Wilson," he began, his voice carrying a slight tremor that was unusual for a judge. "That Combat Infantry badge and Bronze Star with V device, were you with the 173rd Airborne Brigade?" "Yes, Your Honor," James replied, standing as straight as his age frame would allow. "Charlie Company, 1968 to 1969. The judge's face visibly paled. He removed his reading glasses slowly, his hand slightly unsteady. "Were you stationed near Dactu, in the Central Highlands?" James nodded, memories flooding back. "Yes, sir. November 1968. The courtroom remained silent, but the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Officer Martinez, still present, watched with growing interest as the exchange between the judge and the defendant took an unexpected turn. Judge Roberts cleared his throat, his judicial demeanor momentarily slipping. "Sergeant Wilson," he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Staff Sergeant James Wilson." James's eyes widened in surprise. Few people knew his former rank, and fewer still used it these days. "That's correct, Your Honor." The judge's next words sent a ripple of murmurs through the courtroom. "Hill 875. You were there on Hill 875. James's grip on his cane tightened. The memories of that hellish battle were still vivid in his mind. The chaos, the gunfire, the screams of wounded men. "I was there, sir." Judge Roberts stood up, something almost never done during traffic court proceedings. His face showed a mix of emotions: disbelief, recognition, and something deeper. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed the courtroom, his voice now strong but filled with emotion. "The man standing before us today, I know him. I was there when—" He paused, composing himself. "Mr. Wilson, do you remember a young lieutenant, badly wounded, whom you carried down that hill under heavy fire?" The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Mrs. Rodriguez, from her seat, watched as James's expression changed from confusion to gradual recognition. The memories of that day, usually kept carefully locked away, came rushing back. "The young lieutenant," James said slowly, "with the shrapnel wounds. You were pinned down behind that fallen tree." Judge Roberts nodded, tears now visible in his eyes. "You came back for me. The medic said to leave me. The fire was too heavy. But you came back. You carried me over your shoulder for almost a mile, under constant enemy fire." James remembered that day clearly now, the weight of the wounded lieutenant on his shoulders, the sound of bullets whizzing past, the determination to not leave anyone behind. "It was my duty, sir. We never left a man behind." The judge stepped down from his bench, something unprecedented in his courtroom. He approached James, standing face to face with the man who had saved his life decades ago. The entire courtroom watched in stunned silence as Judge Roberts extended his hand. "I never knew your full name," the judge said, his voice thick with emotion. "After I was evacuated, I tried to find you, to thank you. But in the chaos of war, I lost track. I thought about you every day since then, wondered if you made it home." James took the judge's hand, and for a moment, both men stood there, brothers in arms reunited after more than 5 decades. The simple traffic violation that had brought them together seemed trivial now, overshadowed by the weight of their shared history. Officer Martinez wiped a tear from her eye, and Mrs. Rodriguez dabbed at her face with a handkerchief. The other people in the courtroom sat in respectful silence, witnesses to an extraordinary moment of reunion that none of them had expected to see in traffic court that morning. The story of what happened next would soon spread throughout Springfield, becoming a testament to the enduring bonds forged in war and the unexpected ways that fate sometimes works to right old wrongs. After the emotional recognition, Judge Roberts composed himself and returned to his bench, though his eyes never left James. "Mr. Wilson, please tell the court what brought you here today," he requested, his tone much softer than his usual judicial manner. James cleared his throat and began to explain. "Your Honor, I ran that red light because I was late for my VA appointment. My medication was running low, and his voice faltered slightly. "I've been having trouble with the nightmares again." The judge nodded understanding, remembering his own struggles with PTSD. "And what happened with your appointment?" "I missed it, sir," James replied, his voice heavy with resignation. "By the time I got there, they couldn't see me. The next available appointment was weeks away. I've been rationing my medication since then." Officer Martinez stepped forward without being called. "Your Honor, if I may." At the judge's nod, she continued. "When I stopped Mr. Wilson that morning, he was clearly distressed about missing his appointment. If I had known about his situation—" Judge Roberts raised his hand. "Officer, you did your duty, as Mr. Wilson did his all those years ago." He turned his attention back to James. "Are you still having transportation issues, Mr. Wilson?" "Yes, Your Honor. I can't drive at night anymore due to my vision, and some days, when my arthritis is bad, I can barely hold the steering wheel. My wife used to help, but since she passed—" James paused, steadying himself. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been listening intently, stood up from her seat. "Your Honor, I help when I can, but I work most days. Many of us in the neighborhood try to assist, but it's not always enough." The judge listened thoughtfully, making notes on his pad. The courtroom remained silent, the usual bustle of traffic court completely forgotten as this story unfolded. "Mr. Wilson," Judge Roberts began, "what medications are you currently needing?" James pulled out a crumpled prescription list from his pocket. His hands shook as he tried to unfold it, and the judge noticed the tremors immediately. A court officer stepped forward to help, taking the paper and bringing it to the judge. As Judge Roberts read the list, his expression grew more concerned. "These are critical medications, Mr. Wilson. Why hasn't the VA set up a proper transportation service for you?" "They have a service, sir," James explained, "but it's overwhelmed. Too many veterans, not enough drivers. Sometimes I wait hours, sometimes they can't come at all. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, memories of his own post-war struggles clearly weighing on his mind. The courtroom waited in respectful silence as he considered the situation. "Mr. Wilson," he finally said, "this court is faced with an unusual situation. The law says you ran a red light, which is a violation, but the law also recognizes extenuating circumstances, and more importantly, our community has obligations to its veterans." He paused, looking at Officer Martinez, who nodded slightly in agreement. "Before I make my ruling, I need to ask you something. That day on Hill 875, why did you come back for me? The odds were against both of us making it out alive." James stood straighter, his voice firm despite his age. "Because that's what we did, sir. We took care of our own. No one gets left behind." The judge's eyes glistened. "And yet here we are, letting our veterans get left behind every day." He turned to his clerk. "Get me Judge Peterson from Veterans Court on the phone during the next recess. And contact the VA Hospital Director's office." Looking back at James, Judge Roberts' expression softened. "Mr. Wilson, this court is going to take a short recess. When we return, we're going to do more than just address a traffic violation. It's time we followed your example and made sure no one gets left behind." As the bailiff called for recess, the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation. Mrs. Rodriguez hurried to James's side to help him to a seat, while Officer Martinez spoke quietly with the judge's clerk. Something bigger than a simple traffic court case was unfolding, and everyone present could feel it. The story of what Judge Roberts would do next would soon become legend in Springfield. But for now, James sat quietly, unaware that his act of courage from decades ago was about to change not just his life, but the lives of countless other veterans in his community. 1 year after the memorable day in traffic court, Springfield had transformed into a model city for veteran care and support. The Veterans Transportation Network had grown beyond anyone's expectations, serving over 500 veterans and their families across 3 counties. On a bright spring morning, James Wilson stood at a podium in front of the newly renovated VA hospital. Behind him, a row of 12 new transport vans gleamed in the sunlight, each bearing the network's motto, "No one left behind." Judge Roberts stood nearby, his face beaming with pride as James addressed the gathered crowd. "A year ago," James began, his voice strong and clear, "I was just an old soldier trying to get to his medical appointment. Today, I see something I never expected to see, a community that truly understands what it means to serve." The audience included many familiar faces: Officer Martinez, who now headed the police department's Veteran Liaison Program, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had helped organize a neighborhood support network, and Dr. Chen, who had revolutionized the VA hospital's appointment system. The changes went far beyond transportation. The program had sparked a complete overhaul of veteran services in Springfield. The VA hospital now offered evening and weekend appointments. Local businesses had started a veteran employment initiative. Even the city's building codes had been updated to require better accessibility features in new constructions. Judge Roberts stepped up to the podium after James. "One traffic violation brought us here," he said, "but it was Mr. Wilson's lifetime of service that showed us the way. Today, we're not just celebrating a successful program, we're celebrating a change in how we treat our veterans." The judge then revealed the program's latest expansion, a new mobile medical unit that would bring basic healthcare services directly to homebound veterans. The crowd applauded as James and Judge Roberts cut the ribbon together, their hands steady and sure. But perhaps the most meaningful change was visible in James himself. Gone was the trembling, anxious man who had stood before the traffic court a year ago. In his place stood a community leader, mentor, and inspiration to others. Every Tuesday morning, James could be found at the VA hospital's coffee shop, sharing stories with younger veterans. He helped them navigate the system, offered advice, and most importantly, listened to their struggles. His experiences, both from Vietnam and from navigating life as an aging veteran, provided valuable insights that helped shape the program's continuing development. Mrs. Rodriguez often remarked that she hadn't seen him smile so much since before Martha passed away. The purpose he had found in helping other veterans had given him a new lease on life. His hands rarely shook anymore, and his nightmares had become less frequent. As the ceremony concluded, a young veteran approached James with tears in his eyes. "Sir," he said, I was thinking of giving up on my treatment before this program started. You didn't just help create a transportation network, you saved lives. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story titled 1 Year Later, How a Traffic Ticket Changed a City. The article detailed how Springfield's veteran care model was being studied and implemented by cities across the country. James kept a copy folded in his wallet, next to a photo of his old platoon. That evening, as James sat on his porch with Judge Roberts, sharing coffee and memories, a steady stream of cars passed by his house. Each driver honked and waved, volunteers heading out to pick up veterans for their evening appointments. You know, James, the judge said, using his friend's first name as he now often did, when you carried me down that hill in '68, you saved one life. But what you started here, with that red light and traffic ticket, you've helped save hundreds. James smiled, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. We all have our battles, Mike, he replied, using the judge's first name too. Sometimes the hardest ones come after we're home. As darkness fell over Springfield, the lights of the transport vans could be seen moving through the city streets like guardian angels. The program that had started with one veteran's struggle had become a beacon of hope for many. And somewhere in the city, another veteran was getting the help they needed because James Wilson had run a red light and met a judge who remembered that no one should be left behind, not in war and not at home. The end. The days following the emotional courtroom scene brought swift and dramatic changes to Springfield's veteran community. Judge Roberts wasted no time in implementing his promises. Within 48 hours of the hearing, he had assembled a task force comprising local officials, VA representatives, and community leaders. James found himself at the center of an unexpected whirlwind of activity. The morning after the court hearing, a VA social worker arrived at his apartment, accompanied by Dr. Sarah Chen, the new hospital director. They sat at his small kitchen table while Mrs. Rodriguez served coffee, listening intently as James described the challenges he and other veterans faced. Mr. Wilson, Dr. Chen said, reviewing his medical records, I want to personally apologize for the difficulties you've experienced. We're implementing immediate changes to our appointment system. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a new prescription bottle. First, let's make sure you have your proper medication dosage. Meanwhile, Judge Roberts had converted his garage into a temporary command center. Photos of the operation showed him in his shirt sleeves, surrounded by maps and volunteer lists. His personal secretary later revealed that he hadn't left the courthouse until midnight on the day of the hearing, making calls and drafting proposals. The local newspaper ran a front-page story titled, From Battlefield to Courthouse, A Hero's Journey Continues. The article detailed not just James's heroic actions in Vietnam, but also highlighted the broader issues facing elderly veterans in their community. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By the end of the week, more than 50 people had volunteered to drive veterans to their medical appointments. Local auto dealerships donated 3 vans, and a retired mechanic offered free maintenance. The city council fast-tracked approval for dedicated parking spaces at the VA hospital. James watched these developments with quiet amazement. One afternoon, as he sat on his porch with Mrs. Rodriguez, a group of young veterans from the local VFW post arrived. They had come to install a new ramp and handrails, making it easier for him to navigate his front steps. Sir, one of the young veterans said as they worked, Judge Roberts told us what you did on Hill 875. We wanted to help. The young man paused, then added softly, my grandfather was in Vietnam too. He didn't make it home. The Veterans Transportation Network, as it came to be known, quickly grew beyond just providing rides. Volunteers began helping with grocery shopping, home repairs, and even companionship visits. The program became a model for other communities across the state. Officer Martinez, who had issued the original traffic ticket, became one of the program's most dedicated volunteers. She organized a group of off-duty police officers who took turns driving veterans to their appointments. Sometimes, she told the local news, what looks like a violation of the law leads us to find a way to serve justice better. 1 month after the court hearing, Judge Roberts hosted a ceremony in the courthouse plaza. James sat in the front row, wearing his uniform, as the judge unveiled a new plaque dedicating the Veterans Transportation Network to those who never left anyone behind. The ceremony was attended by veterans of all ages, from World War II to recent conflicts. Many shared their own stories of struggling with transportation and medical care. A Vietnam veteran in a wheelchair spoke about missing appointments because he couldn't find reliable transportation. "Thanks to this program," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that won't happen anymore." James's story had sparked something larger than himself. The program was helping not just veterans but their families too. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed that James seemed more relaxed now, knowing he had reliable transportation and a support system in place. "You see," she told him one evening, "sometimes angels come in different forms. Sometimes they wear judges' robes instead of wings." The most significant change, however, was in James himself. His hands had stopped shaking as much since he got back on his proper medication schedule. He was sleeping better, and the nightmares had become less frequent. The weight of isolation that had pressed down on him since Martha's passing had lifted somewhat, replaced by a sense of purpose. As autumn turned to winter in Springfield, the story of the traffic violation that changed a community continued to inspire others. But for James Wilson, sitting in his favorite chair with his medals and Judge Roberts' combat infantry badge nearby, the greatest victory wasn't about the programs or the recognition. It was about remembering that the spirit of no one left behind could live on, decades after the war, in ways he never expected. When court resumed after the recess, Judge Roberts' demeanor had changed noticeably. He had removed his judicial robe, revealing a crisp suit underneath, and his eyes held a determined look. The clerk handed him several papers, which he reviewed quickly before addressing the courtroom. "Before we proceed," Judge Roberts began, his voice carrying more emotion than usual, "I want to share something with this court." He pulled out an old, worn photograph from his desk and held it up. This picture was taken 2 days before the battle on Hill 875. I'm the young lieutenant on the left. The photograph made its way to James, who held it with trembling hands. The image showed a group of young soldiers, their faces dirty but smiling, unaware of the hell they would face in the coming days. "Mr. Wilson," the judge continued, "what happened after you carried me down that hill? I was evacuated so quickly, I never knew the full story." James looked up from the photograph, his mind traveling back to that chaotic day. "After getting you to the medics, sir, I went back up. There were more wounded." His voice grew quieter. "Made 3 more trips before taking a bullet myself." The judge's hands gripped the edge of his bench. 3 more trips? Under that heavy fire? "Yes, sir. Brought down Private Jenkins, Corporal Martinez, and—" James's voice cracked slightly. "And what was left of Sergeant Thompson." The courtroom was silent as the weight of his words sank in. Officer Martinez, who had been standing quietly, wiped away a tear. "Your Honor," James continued, straightening his shoulders, "I don't tell this story for recognition. We all did what we had to do that day." Judge Roberts stood up, struggling to maintain his composure. "Mr. Wilson, you received the Bronze Star with valor for your actions that day. But what strikes me now is that you're still serving, still fighting. Only now, you're fighting a system that's failing you and other veterans." He picked up the papers his clerk had brought. "During our recess, I made several calls. Judge Peterson from Veterans Court is here today." He gestured to a man in the gallery who stood up briefly. "And I've spoken with the VA hospital director." The judge's voice grew stronger. "This court is not just here to punish infractions but to serve justice, and sometimes, justice requires us to look beyond the letter of the law to its spirit." He turned to Officer Martinez. "Officer, what are your thoughts on this case?" She stepped forward. "Your Honor, having witnessed Mr. Wilson's situation firsthand, I believe this case represents a larger issue. We're failing our veterans when they have to choose between following traffic laws and receiving vital medical care." Judge Roberts nodded. "I agree," he turned back to James. "Mr. Wilson, regarding your traffic violation, this court hereby dismisses the charge." But he wasn't finished. "However, we're going to do more than that. Judge Peterson has agreed to help establish a veterans transportation network, effective immediately. We're going to coordinate with the VA to ensure that no veteran has to risk their safety or break the law to receive medical care." The judge's voice cracked with emotion as he continued. 55 years ago, you refused to leave a wounded soldier behind. Today, this court refuses to leave you behind." James stood at attention, his back straight despite his years, as Judge Roberts stepped down from the bench once again. The judge approached him, this time holding something in his hand, a small pin with crossed rifles. "This was my combat infantry badge," the judge said softly. "I've kept it all these years, waiting to find the man who saved my life to thank him properly." He carefully pinned it on James's uniform, next to his own medals. The courtroom, normally a place of stern justice, erupted in spontaneous applause. Mrs. Rodriguez was openly crying, and even the bailiff was discreetly wiping his eyes. But this was more than just an emotional moment in a courtroom. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that would grow to help countless veterans in their community. As James stood there, his aged hand steady for the first time in weeks, he realized that sometimes the biggest victories come from the most unexpected battles. The story of what happened that day in traffic court would spread far beyond Springfield, but the real impact was just beginning to unfold.